Day 5 is when the trajectory starts to become visible. Not in a dramatic way. This is not the day everything gets better. But there are measurable, documented changes that begin at this point in cessation that were not occurring on days 3 or 4. The most significant, tyrosine hydroxylase gene expression, is beginning to upregulate in the ventral tegmental area. Tyrosine hydroxylase is the rate-limiting enzyme in dopamine production. Its upregulation means the molecular machinery for increased dopamine synthesis is being assembled, at the transcriptional level, for the first time since you quit. This doesn't mean you feel good today. Dopamine levels remain below baseline, but the direction of travel is established. The deficit is being addressed from within. At the same time, craving frequency has dropped to approximately 4 to 5 per day, and the character of what remains is shifting. The visceral physical urgency of days 1 and 2, the acute pharmacokinetic craving, has largely passed. What remains is behavioral, cravings that appear in association with specific situations, times of day, emotional states, or environmental cues. These are conditioned responses, understanding that distinction matters for how you manage them. This video covers hours 97 through 120. Hour 97. Tyrosine hydroxylase gene expression is beginning to upregulate in the ventral tegmental area. This is the specific molecular event that represents the brain beginning to rebuild its dopamine production capacity. While dopamine levels remain below baseline, the enzymatic machinery is being assembled. The recovery process has a start date, today. At hour 98, bronchial cilia are beating at approximately 6 to 8 Hz, up from 4 to 6 Hz 2 days ago. Each incremental increase improves the mucociliary escalator's efficiency. The rate of particulate clearance from your lower airways is accelerating. Hour 99. Peripheral insulin sensitivity is measurably improving. The 5 days of nicotine clearance have allowed pancreatic beta cells to recover from nicotine-induced oxidative stress. Glucose-stimulated insulin secretion is becoming more precisely calibrated. Energy levels are starting to feel more consistent through the day as blood sugar swings become less pronounced. Hour 100. You have been nicotine-free for 100 hours. At this point, the brain has completed an estimated 25 to 35% of total nicotinic receptor normalization. Each pruned receptor represents one fewer binding site that will demand nicotine. The receptor density is moving measurably toward non-smoker levels. At hour 101, morning cortisol peaks are approximately 10 to 15% lower than they were at hour 73. Still above pre-cessation baseline, but the trend is established. Mornings feel slightly less oppressive. Irritability may peak later in the day rather than immediately upon waking, which represents a shift in the cortisol awakening response, becoming more physiologically normal. Hour 102. Beta-endorphin levels in the arcuate nucleus are beginning to normalize. Nicotine had co-opted the endogenous opioid system to reinforce reward. Each use delivered an endorphin signal alongside the dopamine response. Its removal temporarily impaired natural pain modulation and mood elevation through endorphin pathways. The system is recovering. Physical discomforts may have seemed magnified these past 4 days for this reason. At hour 103, the oral microbiome is shifting. Pathogenic anaerobic bacteria that thrived under nicotine's immunosuppressive conditions are being displaced by commensal flora as salivary IgA levels recover. The microbial ecosystem of your mouth is rebalancing toward a healthier composition. Hour 104. Sleep pressure is normalizing. Adenosine receptor sensitivity is recalibrating. Adenosine is the molecular signal that builds during waking hours to create the physiological drive to sleep. Nicotine had modulated adenosine signaling, disrupting this accumulation. Normal patterns are reestablishing. You may start feeling genuinely tired at appropriate times rather than experiencing the unpredictable, fragmented fatigue of earlier days. Hour 105. Craving episodes have declined to approximately 4 to 5 per day. The clinical description of what's happening is precise. The body is no longer screaming for nicotine. But contextual cues, the situations and environments previously associated with use, are still activating conditioned responses. This is a biological process. The dorsal striatum, which mediates habitual behavior, has stored the associations between environmental cues and the act of vaping or smoking. Those associations were built over hundreds or thousands of repetitions. They weaken through a process called extinction, which requires experiencing the cue without the behavior, repeatedly over time. Every craving you sit through today is an extinction trial. Every time you experience a trigger without using, the conditioned association weakens slightly. The insula, which generates the interoceptive craving experience, is being progressively decoupled from its automatic response to those cues. This is slow, but it's happening. At hour 106, peripheral nerve recovery is producing something you may be able to feel. Sensory nerve endings in the fingertips and oral mucosa are recovering from nicotine-induced desensitization. Tactile acuity and temperature sensitivity are improving. Touch may feel slightly sharper. Textures slightly more defined. This is real sensory recovery. Hour 107. Natural killer cell cytotoxic activity is improving. Nicotine had suppressed NK cell function 30 to 40% by inhibiting perforin and granzyme release. Restored NK function strengthens the body's cancer surveillance system. This recovery is invisible to you subjectively, but it is happening in your blood right now. At hour 108, acetylcholine signaling is recalibrating. With surplus nicotinic receptors being pruned, the remaining receptors are responding more appropriately to naturally produced acetylcholine. This improves cognitive functions that depend on cholinergic transmission, specifically memory consolidation and sustained attention. You may notice brief windows where mental clarity feels improved. These windows will lengthen. Hour 109. Alveolar macrophages, your lungs' resident immune cells, have recovered phagocytic capacity significantly from the 30 to 50% suppression of active vaping. 5 days of clean air is restoring their ability to engulf pathogens and particulate matter. If you've had a cough intensify over the past 2 days, this is macrophages doing their job more effectively than they've been able to in some time. At hour 110, resting metabolic rate has decreased by approximately 150 to 200 calories per day compared to active vaping. Nicotine's thermogenic effect via uncoupling protein 1 activation in brown adipose tissue has resolved. This metabolic shift is permanent until counteracted by other means. Specifically, resistance exercise preserves lean mass and partially offsets the metabolic slowdown. This is not a character flaw or lack of willpower. It is specific biochemistry. Hour 111. D2 dopamine receptors in the striatum are upregulating. This compensatory increase in receptor density, the brain building more sensitivity to the dopamine that is available, will eventually restore normal hedonic tone. You may notice the very earliest signs: slightly more interest in activities that have felt completely flat since day one, a flicker of genuine engagement with something. This is the reward circuitry beginning to respond to endogenous dopamine again. At hour 112, arterial wall compliance is measurably improving. Pulse wave velocity, a marker of arterial stiffness, is decreasing as endothelial-dependent vasodilation recovers. The afterload on your heart is reducing. Your cardiovascular system is more efficient today than it was at hour 1. Hour 113. Salivary flow rate is increasing as parasympathetic innervation of the parotid and submandibular glands recovers from nicotine's disruption. Improved saliva production enhances oral antimicrobial defense and is beginning to reverse the dry mouth pathology that chronic vapors commonly experience. If your mouth has felt less dry today, this is why. Hour 114. REM rebound is active. Nicotine had suppressed REM sleep duration by 10 to 20% throughout your period of use. The brain is now compensating with increased REM pressure. Tonight or tomorrow night may feature unusually vivid, emotionally intense dreams. The content may involve vaping or smoking. This is the brain processing withdrawal content through sleep architecture, not evidence of psychological fixation. It is documented, common, and temporary. At hour 115, functional MRI studies show prefrontal cortex activation during cognitive tasks beginning to normalize. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, critical for working memory and planning, is reestablishing efficient firing patterns. You may notice brief windows of improved concentration that didn't exist on days 3 or 4. These windows will lengthen over the next few days as receptor normalization continues. Hour 116. Every residual molecule of carbon monoxide from vaping-related pyrolysis is entirely eliminated. Carboxyhemoglobin is at non-smoker baseline of less than 1%. Every red blood cell is now fully available for oxygen transport. Hemoglobin oxygen carrying capacity is at 100%. At hour 117, gastrointestinal motility is recalibrating. Nicotine had stimulated colonic contractions via enteric nervous system nicotinic receptors. Its absence may have caused transient constipation in the first 4 days. By day 5, enteric neurons are adapting, and bowel regularity is beginning to return. Digestive discomfort, if present, is resolving. Hour 118. Synaptic plasticity in the mesolimbic pathway is actively reorganizing. Long-term potentiation patterns at glutamatergic synapses onto ventral tegmental area dopamine neurons are beginning to weaken. This is the molecular mechanism by which drug-associated reward memories lose their strength. The mesolimbic circuit is being restructured away from its nicotine-associated patterns. This is exactly what recovery looks like at the synaptic level. 120 hours. 5 full days nicotine-free. The clinical summary for this milestone. The brain has pruned an estimated 30 to 40% of surplus nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. Dopamine synthesis is beginning to recover. Tyrosine hydroxylase activity is increasing at the transcriptional level. Cravings average 4 to 5 per day and are increasingly psychological rather than physical. Sleep architecture is showing measurable improvement over days 1 and 2. The hardest neurochemical phase of the sprint is behind you. What remains is the continued normalization of receptor density, the continued recovery of dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine systems, and the progressive extinction of conditioned behavioral triggers through repeated cue exposure without use. The clinical literature identifies the transition from day 5 to day 6 as the point where many people have their first extended period, not just a moment, but an hour or more, where they feel genuinely okay, not euphoric. Okay, that is a measurable improvement over the anhedonia that has dominated this week. Day 6. Neural consolidation. Slow-wave sleep deepens. Conditioned cues begin losing their charge through extinction. The serotonin system stabilizes. And you're 1 day from 1 week, a clinically meaningful threshold where long-term